for inviting. Yeah. Apa kabar? Baik.
Assalamualaikum Pak Irma.
Assalamualaikum.
Ya, selamat siang.
Siang, Pak.
Apa kabar?
Kabar baik, Makassar lagi mendung.
Baik, baik.
Kalau Jogja ini panas banget, termasuk panas di Jogja.
Lima.
Shall I start or
Mbak Dian, mungkin kita bisa mulai.
Is it me or another Dian?
no, it's another Dian. Dian Irma.
Mbak Dian, that should be the moderator. Which one is she? Mbak Dian, silahkan memoderatori.
Mute dulu Mbak Dian.
But Dian, maybe you can speak without the headset. Maybe there's a problem with your headset.
Mbak Dian, are you there? Or Mbak Nuzul instead, can you please be the moderator?
Maybe while we waiting Mbak Dian, Mbak Tiwi, maybe you can help us to take over the moderator, please.
Okay. Can everyone hear my voice right now?
Yeah, just
yes,
go on.
very clear.
Okay. Hopefully it's clear. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Assalamualaikum. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Thank you, Professor Irma, for coming today, bringing this topic and sharing the case study from Australia. Actually, it's quite unprepared today, but I will try to moderate or to synchronize and reconcile this discussion. Okay, today we are going to talk about the experience in Australia on intergenerational experience of family related to joblessness, and then about social welfare and also children welfare. And then I think it's quite crucial when the joblessness is not addressed, and then it's related to the cultural and social capital like education, and also economic capital. But how does Australia address this issue? So I think we can learn about this issue along with Professor Irma. But before the discussion is started, I think I need to give time for Ibu Nurul Hilmiati for one or a few sentences to open this discussion. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mbak Tiwi. Good afternoon once again, Prof. Irma. Thank you very much for being here with us. It is such a pleasure to have you here with us this afternoon. And I also would like to pass a warm regards from our head of center, Professor Ali Humaydi, who is away at the moment. He is still in a remote place in the eastern part of Indonesia. A few sentences from our center. In this good opportunity, I would like to introduce our center, Center for Social Welfare, Village and Connectivity, which is under the National Research and Innovation Agency. We are a new organization coming from various research and development division from various ministries, such as Ministry of Agriculture, Social, Village, Agrarian Affairs, and also Spatial Planning. So among the focus in our research center include the research on social security and protection, strengthening on livelihood system and well-being, technology utilization and local wisdom, and also innovation creation for village development. The character on our research center here is mainstreaming the external research with orientation for community development. So it is expected that the models, policy formulation, and also the strategies for village development from our center can be implemented across the nations. Of course, depends on the social and also specific location of the respective areas in Indonesia. Therefore, it is very crucial to continuously develop our human resource here in our centers, like what we are doing this afternoon. So once again, thank you very much, Prof. Irma. I hope that this discussion today is a seed to build a future collaboration with our center as well as with your university. And without any further ado, we can't wait for your talk and return back to Mbak Tiwi.
Okay, thank you, Ibu Nurul, for the opening speech. So before Professor Irma deliver the material, I would like to introduce to all this Civitas KSDK about Professor Irma or Ibu Irma. Professor Irma is a professor of sociology, particularly social policy and social theory, at the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Melbourne in Australia. She is also Deputy Director of renowned journal Gender and Society, adjunct principal fellow in the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research, and an associate investigator for the RXD Center for Excellence for Children and Families over the Life course. So I think she has quite a comprehensive experience in some issues, including poverty, social welfare, and also children welfare. So without any further ado, I think joblessness is related to also poverty, and it can influence the children welfare. So I think Australia has some kind of experience that Professor Irma will address in this discussion. And now for Professor Irma, I would like to give the time for you to deliver the material. Thank you.
Terima kasih Bu Pratiwi dan Bu Nurul. Selamat sore. Terima kasih telah bergabung dengan presentasi ini. Saya senang berada di sini hari ini untuk menyajikan bukti terbaru kami tentang hukuman pengangguran orang tua untuk hasil masa depan anak-anak. Hello, everyone. I hope what I just said made sense. I would like to thank the Brin and Diane and all of you for inviting me today to deliver this presentation. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining this presentation today. I see that we have 75 people attending, which is fantastic. I'm also very delighted to share with you the latest evidence of the work that I've done together with my colleagues from the Melbourne Institute, and also my postdoc that was related to this project. And this is a project that is funded by the Australian Research Council and aimed at providing a bigger picture about the effects of parental joblessness on children's socioeconomic and health outcomes. Let me now share my screen for this presentation. Okay, I hope you can all see the slides. Yes?
Yes, I think it's clear now. Yeah.
So I would like to start with an acknowledgement. I would like to thank and acknowledge the contribution of my team members, that is Professor Mark Wooden from the Melbourne Institute, Professor Tim Liao from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and also our postdoc in this project, Matthew Curry, who now works at the University of Queensland. Why this research? Well, to give you some background information about joblessness in Australia, Australia is one of the OECD countries with the highest proportion of children who live in households where no parent is in paid employment, something that we refer as parental joblessness. According to data from the HILDA survey, which is a panel survey that follows thousands of households in Australia since 2001, about 1 in 7 Australians who were born between 1984 and 1996 were exposed to the simultaneous joblessness of the coinciding parents during their childhood or adolescence. This, so 1 in 7 represents about 13.5% of men and women in this age range. So you can see this also from the plot that you have in front of you. The share of children who were exposed to parental joblessness has remained very high since 2001. Now, this proportion of jobless households and of children that are exposed to parental joblessness is likely to grow further in the future, given the continuing socioeconomic disruptions that are caused by COVID-19, given the growing automation, job precarity, but also the incidence and the prevalence of contingent employment or non-standard employment contracts. That's why it's very important to understand the size and the persistence of parental joblessness on children's life chances, because these exposures and the prevalence of parental joblessness will be not only highly prevalent at the population level, but also occur at a greater rate given the current health, economic, and social crisis. So despite the considerable proportion of jobless households in Australia, until we started to work on this project, we knew very little about the incidence and the impact of dual parent joblessness on children's life chances. In fact, there is only limited understanding, both in Australia and internationally, of the challenges that these children face as they grow up. So we don't know what it is about parental joblessness that scars or that penalizes children. We don't know when and how much it matters for children's outcomes. And more importantly, what can be done to reduce these intergenerational disadvantages and penalties for children? These are all questions that I will try to address during this presentation. But the take-home message that I have for you today is that it is not parental joblessness per se that penalizes children's outcomes, but it is the intensity of exposure to parental joblessness that determines the size and the persistence of disadvantage. There is also some good news because In 2 of our studies, we find that these scars and penalties can be mitigated if policy is well targeted. So my talk today will be divided in 3 parts. The first part would be, I'll talk briefly about the mechanisms. What are the mechanisms, and what do theories tell us about the process underlying the parent-child relationship? In the second part, I'll share the key findings of our work that will focus on children's joblessness, transitions to work, labor force trajectories, wages, personality traits, and health outcomes. And then in the third part of my talk, I will reveal some factors that moderate the intergenerational scars of disadvantage, and also tell something more about what these findings mean for policy and how policy can address these issues. Now, let me start with the mechanisms. What are the mechanisms? Well, there are various theoretical frameworks that help us explain about the negative effects of joblessness and how these are transmitted to children. A first explanation from economic and sociological theories argues that parental joblessness changes or reduces family incomes, which in turn influences children's outcomes. And these outcomes can be early careers, wages, employment trajectories, personality traits, and mental health outcomes. So what happens is when parents do not work, and when both of them do not work at the same time, it means that families will have less finances. They will have fewer incomes and fewer resources that they can use to purchase educational goods, to purchase services that helps parents to create a stimulating and also enriching learning environment for their children to do well at school or to find employment. With fewer incomes or with little incomes, parents will have limited access to purchase nutritious food and to invest in proper education or healthcare. They will have limited access to provide children with regular preventive medical checkups or screenings, which in turn will influence children's performance at school, but also their health outcomes. So another pathway and another important factor that influences the link between parental joblessness and children's outcomes is parental time. So when, and that may sound a bit, well, in contrast with what you may think, is that parental joblessness also limits the time, the available time that parents have to spend with children. And this is because parents that are not working, they are put under enormous strain and distress, which may lead to reductions in time, so in quantity, so the number of hours that parents spend with their children, but also the quality of time that parents involve when kind of and their affections to their children. And so all of this together, the reduced quantity and quality of time leads to poor children's outcomes, and especially poor mental and general health outcomes for their children. Parental joblessness also influences family harmony. So it can influence within family households or within household relationships and satisfaction, or what we call family harmony. This in turn can also affect children's outcomes later in life. For example, parental stress that is caused by parental joblessness can strain within household relationships or deepen ongoing relationship dissatisfaction between parents. So it can lead to marital conflict, it can lead to quarrelings and fightings within parents, but also between parents and children. And this together will increase the risk that children themselves feel stressed or overburdened, which in turn also again influences negatively children's socioeconomic and health outcomes. Finally, there is also a direct link between the two, meaning that parental joblessness can influence children's outcomes by influencing what children learn and how they behave in later life. For example, observing their parents out of paid work for longer periods of time can make children more resistant to the stigma that is associated with joblessness. And this, in turn, can change children's ambitions and interests in seeking employment or in engaging in educational activities. Consequently, children could become less engaged in education and training and more detached from employment. So overall, given all these arguments and theories, we expect greater exposure to parental joblessness to lead or to be negatively associated with children's later socioeconomic and health outcomes. Now, before I present our evidence, I would like to define the sample selection and setup of our study. So in our study, the sample that we analyzed consisted of children who lived in a household where the primary carer or carers were out of paid employment, this included also step-parents and adoptive parents who lived in the same household as a child, aged between 5 and 17 years old during the first 7 waves of the HILDA survey. So this is the setup. So what we did is we traced parents' overlapping spells of joblessness by looking at parents' employment histories and counted the cumulative proportion of time when both parents experienced spells of joblessness at the same time. And so with this information, we created this variable that provided the proportion of time in which children were exposed to parental joblessness during the first 7 years of the survey. And that proportion ranges from 0, not exposed, or not having lived in a household where parents were jobless at the same time, or 100%, which means that children were observed to live in households where both parents were jobless all the time. So next, we observed children's outcomes for those young adults that reported a valid labor force status during 2008 and onwards, who were not in full-time education. And as you can see, we focused on a range of outcomes. So our studies have looked at the likelihood of joblessness of children, transitions from school to work, early labor force trajectories, wage outcomes, personality traits, and health outcomes. And I'll be presenting the key findings from each of the studies that we've done. So I would like to start with a description of labor force states of children that were exposed by parental joblessness compared to children who did not experience joblessness from their parents. So I would like you to focus on the left-hand side of the plot, which is the plot that summarizes the number of children who were not exposed to parental joblessness. So these children grew up in households where both parents were continuously employed. Well, as you can see, is that that right after leaving education, which is here in year 1, most of young people find employment in permanent contracts, which is this purple color. And so they find either employment in permanent color or casual employment, which is this green color. And the proportion of transitions to permanent employment over time as they build more tenure and experience increases, such that by year 5, as you can see here, by year 5, more than half of young people that were not exposed to parental joblessness move to jobs that are regular jobs with regular contract. And regular, I mean permanent contract and not casual or temporary contract, which is something that is definitely necessary if young people are planning for the future and are at a phase where they have to make decisions about demographic transitions as well, setting up a family, having children, getting married, etc. So permanent employment provides that condition for these young people to make these important demographic transitions later in life. Now, the right plot, which is on the right-hand side, shows a very different picture among young children who were exposed by parental joblessness. Well, as you can see, first of all, the proportion of children who start their career in a permanent employment is much lower than proportion of children that we could see here on the left-hand side of the plot, right? And so, as you can see, is that there is a fairly high proportion of children in this that were exposed by parental joblessness who were either unemployed or inactive at the very start of their careers, but that also remain in these states later on, 5 years after leaving education. So you can see that this area, this blue area and orange area, from year 1 until year 5, after children, disadvantaged children, complete education, this is very stable. And what that tells us is that this is actually something that will become much more obvious in the next plot, which tells us the relative proportion of children that find employment or change labor force statuses during the first 5 years. So this plot that we have here, this lists, or this presents the cumulative proportion of labor force states within the 5 years since young people left education or completed education. We start here with a group of young children who were not exposed to parental joblessness during the observation period, followed by children that were observed, that were kind of exposed between 1 until 1/3 of the time. And then also we have here another group which is severely exposed to parental joblessness, meaning that they were exposed 1/3 or all the time by their parental joblessness. And again, strikingly again, you can see that young children or young people who were not exposed to parental joblessness, that we have a kind of a joblessness rate of about 20% during the first years after they complete education. And what we also see is that the proportion of permanent employment also increases with tenure and experience. So by year 5, we can see a bigger proportion of children in permanent employment, and well, relatively fewer people in casual employment. So of course, the picture is very different when we look into the severely employed. And what is very striking here is that about 50% of young Australians that were severely exposed to parental joblessness start their careers as jobless, as you can see here. So the purple and the red color indicate inactivity and unemployment, which altogether make the joblessness state. And then, as you can see here, is that almost 50% of these young children remain in joblessness 5 years after they complete education. It's something that we also could see from the previous plots, but here we have the relative number, so we can make sense and better compare the labor force states across children with different exposure to parental joblessness. In terms of labor force dynamics during the first year after they leave education, we see also striking differences between children exposed and not exposed to parental joblessness. So in this plot, you can see the labor market dynamics of children who grew up in households where both parents worked. And as you can see, there is at the start of their careers, there is a large proportion of children in permanent jobs, followed by also relatively large proportion of young people in casual jobs. And by year 5, as we can see, is that about half of the children that start in casual jobs, they move to jobs that are permanent. And so by the end of year 5, we can see that the biggest proportion of young children who are not exposed to parental joblessness are employed. And there is there's very little people or fewer proportion of people who are unemployed, inactive, followed by the proportion of people who are in fixed-term jobs or casual jobs. So again, this is something that we could see in the first plots, but this plot shows the dynamics of the changes in the labor force statuses in a much more dynamic way. Now, again, when we focus on the medium to high exposed group of young people, we can see that compared to the different states, we can see that the children that start their careers as inactive or unemployed, which we define as jobless, is much higher at the start of their careers. And unfortunately, there is also state dependence, meaning that children that start careers as inactive also remain inactive 5 years later. And there is very little mobility to jobs that are permanent, but also limited mobility to jobs that are casual or fixed-term contracts. And we can see that there is much more mobility towards unemployment. So those who are inactive are unemployed. The other way around, we can see that a high proportion of children who were unemployed move to inactivity, and this is very concerning. And I'm showing, this is the line which is very concerning. This blue line here is that by year 5, many children many young people who start as unemployed become discouraged, and so they no longer look for jobs, and they are kind of discouraged to find employment. Meaning that by year 5, we still have a very high proportion of children severely exposed to parental joblessness that are in a jobless state. And feel free to ask questions, by the way, if there are questions that you have regarding the plots. So, in another study, we also studied the intergenerational links of joblessness, or the intergenerational link of employment, I should better say. And so here it's a very similar plot. Here we start with parents' employment and then compare it with children's employment status. And this tells us whether parents who are employed tend to have children that are employed, and parents who are jobless tend to have children that are jobless. And what we can see here is that about half of the children that grow up with parents who are continuously employed, they manage to find and keep employment throughout their careers. And the other half, which is this half here, it's a half. These are people, or these are children from employed parents who experience prolonged spells of joblessness sometime or 1/3 of the time during the observation period. This trend here captures a trend of economic immobility, I would say. That, or downward mobility, that would be a better word, because it shows us that young people today, even if they lived in households where parents were employed, they are less likely to find employment than their parents, the generation of their parents. And there are different factors that drive this pattern, which I'm not going to discuss in this presentation, but that captures some of that trend. Now, the orange and the blue colors here show again a moderate correlation between parents' joblessness and also their children's joblessness, meaning that parents who were jobless 1/3 of the time also tend to have children that are jobless 1/3 of the time. And then again here, parents who were jobless 2/3 of the time, also half of them have children that were jobless 2/3 of the time. So, and again, this pattern of the correlation between parents' employment and children's employment that seems to be consistent across the employment states. And also there is this moderate link between parents and children. Now this plot is interesting, but still it doesn't tell us whether the labor market trajectories of parents and children are similar. So it only tells us that a labor force status of the parents is generally similar or different between parents and children. Now we wanted to understand whether parents and children's trajectories looked similar to each other. And so what we did here in a study with Professor Tim Liao of University of Illinois, Chicago, Champaign, and Matthew Curry, we examined the labor market trajectories of fathers, mothers, and children, and we put them next to each other to compare whether the trajectories of the father, the mother, and the child looked similar. And to do so, what we did is that we first traced the employment trajectories of parents, and then we looked at the employment trajectory of children 12 years later. And so each of the sequences of the parents and their children that you see in these figures are represented by horizontally stacked lines that are colored again, according to the labor force state, where green indicates employment, purple indicates unemployment, and orange indicates unemployment. Orange indicates, jobless or out of the labor force. So this is what we call a triadic relationship, meaning that there are three people that we combine with each other, and then we compare the sequences, the sequences of the labor market trajectory, which in this case encapsulate the succession, the duration, and the length of the labor force trajectory that is followed separately by fathers, mothers, and children. And here I've only copied the job work cluster, and this cluster was a cluster that consisted mainly of parents and children who experienced at least 10% of spells of joblessness during the observation period. And you can see here that the similarity between the trajectories, so what we see here, this is number 21, means that this is father 21, married to mother 21, who is completely out of work. And then this is matched with child number 21, which, as you can see, churns between employment, which is green, and unemployment, and then experiences a period of inactivity during the observation period. So this is the way you should interpret this plot. So father 21 is someone who starts as inactive, then finds employment, green, then moves into unemployment, employment, unemployment, inactivity. So it is a father that struggles to find and keep employment. And this father is married with a mother who is not working, who probably is caring for their children. So is taking the primary care. And again, this family has a child that also shows some similarities with the trajectories of the father and not so much of the mother. And this is, so when we continue with the correlations and we estimate the strength of the similarities or differences between parents and children's labor force trajectories, we find that on average, there is a moderate resemblance between jobless parents and their children's employment trajectories. Well, the good news is that this moderate resemblance, this also tells us that not all children born or that are grown up in jobless households are destined to joblessness. And this tells us that there are children that are able to escape joblessness. And so, which is in a way, you know, it's a well, stimulating, encouraging finding, I would say. So now next, in another study, we investigated the relationship between exposure to parental joblessness and wages as adults. And interestingly, we find that in particular, boys who are exposed to parental joblessness during their adolescence years are most negatively impacted. As you can see here, this is the line here, this is the dashed line, where you can see that the higher the exposure to parental joblessness, where 1 indicates 100% exposed, these children who were exposed during 14 and 17 years, they are also children who experience the deepest and most severest wage penalties later on when they find employment. We don't find a similar result among women, which is this group here, this dashed line. And so the finding that especially ages between 14 and 17, and especially boys that are most likely and most negatively influencing their wage penalties, in a way contrasts some of the findings from economists, like, for instance, James Heckman, because in studies in economy, usually the major finding is that it's especially the youngest children that are hurt the most. Nevertheless, those studies usually focus on health issues, so it could be a matter or a function of the outcome variable, and it could be also a function of a country-specific pattern. And the reason why, at least this is a speculation, we speculate, or we think that the age between 14 and 17 years old is particularly important because this is when children start to develop their identities, and when they develop ideas about how they think about their future. Parental joblessness during this period may influence their views about work and training, which in turn influences their labor market behavior. So this is what we think is the explanation behind this finding. Now, in a more recent study, we examined how exposure to parental joblessness during childhood was associated with personality traits and health. And I'll start with personality traits first. So the idea was that personality traits themselves, that exposure to parental joblessness influences negatively children's personality traits because children are forced to adapt to very stressful and stressful periods, but also also to periods of economic hardship, which may be associated with lower scores of openness to experience, extroversion, self-control, and kind of negatively impact all personality traits, all the big five that we have. In addition to the big five personality traits, we also looked at self-control. And as expected, we found, so this is a model that predicts the mean level of openness to experience, that, as you can see, the greater the proportion of exposure to parental joblessness, the greater the drop in the mean level of openness. And a similar trend exists across these five personality traits, with the exception of conscientiousness, where this personality trait does not seem to differ significantly by the intensity of exposure to parental joblessness. We do see very steep declines in self-control, or in the level of self-control, in the level of agreeableness, and in the level of openness to experience, and also in the level of extroversion, meaning that children become irritated, agitated, they become shy and introvert, and that change in personality trait, that change is highly correlated with that prolonged exposure to parental joblessness. And what these findings tell us is that experiencing parental joblessness before personality traits become stable is correlated with personality traits that tend to be less valued by modern labor markets, which also explains the poor career and wage outcomes that I showed at the beginning of this presentation. So what I'm trying to say is that one of the reasons why we observed penalties in wages and career dynamics of children who were exposed to parental joblessness could be explained by these children's kind of changing their personality traits because of the intensity of exposure to parental joblessness. And now finally, I will move to mental health outcomes. So in this study, we examined the association between parental joblessness and children's health, and we focused on both general health and mental health. But today I will only focus on the mental health outcomes. So when we look into the baseline results, we find that conditional on being selected into the sample, children who were exposed to parental joblessness over the period 2001 to 2007 experienced on average 6.13 points lower mental health in adulthood than those who were never exposed to parental joblessness. And the scale of mental health was from 0 to 100. So this is like 6% yeah. But of course, it's only a baseline relationship, and it doesn't control for a bunch of socioeconomic characteristics or unobserved characteristics. So when we control for all those complicated relationships, then we include all the mediating variables that we defined based on the theories that I mentioned at the very start of this presentation, then what do we see is that there is this direct channel that we continue to find between parental joblessness and children's mental health that remains unexplained when we control for a bunch of characteristics. And of the different channels through which parental joblessness influences children's adult mental health, we find only one indirect pathway that is statistically significant but small in size. And that is this pathway. So we find that there is an indirect negative relationship between parental joblessness and the log of disposable household income. And this is the relationship which tells us that parental joblessness, decreases or reduces household incomes, which we expected using theory. And then the disposable household income then influences the average relationship satisfaction of the mother with the partner. And then this average relationship satisfaction of the mother in turn influences children's mental health outcomes. So and then all the other relationships were either broken or were not significant, with the dashed gray lines indicating not significant relationships or associations between the variables. So we have here an independent relationship between average relationship satisfaction of the father and child's mental health. And then but again, that's not an indirect relationship. So we only found one indirect pathway and a direct pathway. So the product of these indirect effects altogether was minus 0.146, which was significant at 5% level, and suggests that a 0.146 reduction in the mental health index is experienced if children were exposed to parental joblessness. However, of course, given that a standard deviation of the mental health index is only just over 17, this is a small effect. But a small effect when it comes to the indirect effect. But when we combine the direct and indirect effects together and talk about the total effect of parental joblessness on children's health, then the sum of these direct and indirect effects is sizable, and that is minus 4.385. Sorry. Yeah, I think that was not for me. So overall, these results suggest that both direct and indirect pathways contribute to a sizable differential in mental health, but it's the direct effect that is attached to parental joblessness that accounts for the majority of the gap. So as I said, there is a sizable direct effect that is still kind of persisting after we control for a bunch of explanatory variables, and meaning that there is an independent effect of parental joblessness on children's health. Now, having established the deep and persistent penalties of parental joblessness for children's career and wage outcomes, we aimed at identifying factors that mitigate these negative effects. And so in this second part of my presentation, or I think that's the third part of the presentation, I will talk a bit more about these factors. Well, one of the mitigating factor is university education. We argue that university education may shield children from future joblessness because it provides access to resource-rich social networks that place disadvantaged students in settings where they can build networks with advantaged peers who have access to valuable resources and information. We think that universities may also act as recruiting hubs where employers disseminate information about future open positions, and this link adults with each other and adults with companies. And that also includes youth from disadvantaged backgrounds. So further, we also argue that if finding a job is more difficult for children from jobless households because of a lack of social network or a lack of social capital, then a university credential may counteract this disadvantage by providing a trusted signal of quality to employers. Again, we experimented with three groups. So the group denoted in green are those who were not exposed to parental joblessness, followed by the group who were exposed half of the time, and the group in red that was exposed all the time in parental joblessness. And what we did is we interacted the intensity, the groups that reflect the intensity of parental joblessness with whether or not they had a university degree. And so these are the number of days until until these young people find employment. So as you can see from the plot on the left-hand side, the non-university degree graduates, so there is a substantial proportion of children, of young people who are still actually not in employment almost after 3 years after completing education. And we can see here that it's about 20% of those who were exposed 100% of the time are still not or have still not found an employment 3 years later. And this kind of delay in transitions to the labor market are very highly correlated with the degree of exposure to parental joblessness, because as you can see is those in the group denoted in green here that was not exposed, they managed to find employment by year 3, whereas 10% of those who were exposed half of the time do not actually manage to find employment. And then again, those who were exposed all the time, we can see that about 21% are still not able to find employment. Now, this picture is very different among university graduates. You can see that for university graduates, parental joblessness history doesn't really matter, because regardless of exposure to parental joblessness, those who complete university degree manage to find employment at the same velocity as those who were not exposed to parental joblessness. And you can see this because all these lines are very are almost the same, meaning that it doesn't really matter how much you were exposed to parental joblessness, you will be able to find employment at the same rate as those in more favorable conditions. And I think this is a very important finding, which shows the importance of having a higher educational degree and also obtaining those specialized skills that help you to find employment and to better connect with potential firms and companies. We finally also experimented with another kind of factor that we thought could influence or could mitigate joblessness among children, and that was household work. And the argument that we had here is that we thought that household work would mitigate or would help children or would shield young people from the negative effects of parental joblessness, because children who would see their parents engage more in household work would mean that children would develop more positive attitudes about productive work. We thought that household work could mitigate financial stress and shield children from more extreme deprivation, for example, by substituting homegrown vegetables for market vegetables. And we also thought that more parental household labor could reflect also self-reliance and initiative, and this model to children attributes that are useful in later seeking employment. This, we thought that higher parental household work by both mothers and fathers in jobless households could lessen children's probability of themselves becoming jobless as adults. Now, we have here a surprising finding, because we find a gender asymmetry in the moderating role of household work in jobless households, and especially young adults raised in dual parent families in which fathers spend more time in house work during joblessness. They are less likely to become jobless as adults. So seeing their father doing more at work at home helps these young people to prevent joblessness later in life. So this was a summary of more or less all the studies that we've done in this work together. That was, as I said, financed by the Australian Research Council. And based on these findings, we also make 3 recommendations for policy. So in our research, which I didn't highlight here today, we find that a 1% increase in household disposable incomes reduces intergenerational joblessness transmission by about 3%. So improving the financial capacity of jobless families is a critical factor, because it means that if there is more generosity in terms of the financial capacity of jobless families, then that would alleviate persistent joblessness and reduce disadvantage among children. So boosting the generosity of the welfare system could help achieve this goal. And how can this be addressed? Well, this can be addressed through more generous family benefits and top-ups. For example, childcare tax credits, housing vouchers that could provide assistance to low-income jobless households and would help them to reduce income inequality. So this could be one way to do this. However, only improving the households' finances of jobless households through taxation is only one factor, and we think that it should be so that we think that policy initiatives and programs should be aimed at multiple layers and multiple dimensions such that it's not only the taxation that needs to be fixed, but also boosting children's educational achievements. There needs to be more tailored initiatives around transitions to work, encouraging fathers to engage domestically, because as we showed, that has a positive attitude about productive labor and prevents children from experiencing a jobless future themselves. Second recommendation would be to increase flexibility in the provision of childcare and parental leave. We know that one of the reasons for maternal joblessness is often a concern about childcare. So women or mothers tend to stay jobless because there is no childcare arrangement or childcare facilities, or if there is a childcare arrangement, then that's very expensive and these families cannot afford it. And so it's very often that that leads or is highly associated with maternal joblessness. So policy that includes steps like cumulative childcare assistance and more generous paid parental leave could potentially help both parents to stay in employment. And that would ultimately lead to, well, improvement of the financial position and family well-being. Other ideas regarding the flexibility in the provision of childcare would be provided flexible daycare, would be kind of offering extended hours in long daycare, weekend childcare, school holiday care, outside school hours care. So these are all different forms of care that can be offered to households to enable them to actually participate in the labor market and not having to actually, yeah, to stay at home because they cannot afford care. This providing a system, providing available, affordable, and accessible care to households is another key factor that would increase parental employment and in turn would improve the well-being of their children. And finally, a third recommendation would be to develop programs that target better links with potential employers. So our research shows that the intergenerational costs of joblessness are more nuanced for children who go on to obtain a university degree. As I showed earlier, in addition to advancing their skills, university education helps young people to create valuable networks that in turn may lead to smoother transitions to work. And for other young people with a family history of joblessness, programs that target better links with potential employers could help prevent entrenched employment disadvantage. And so finally, we need to improve the skill development and training opportunities for young people in order for them to have better careers and stable careers later in life. So I believe that I've come now to the end of my presentation, and I wanted to thank you all for being here today, and I'm open to receiving your questions. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Ibu Professor Irma. And then I think it reminds me of the research by Daniel Suryadharma, I think in 3 years ago, that he researched about children who were born in poverty and jobless parents will likely to experience lower income when they are adult. They use multi-years. But I think this explanation is quite extensive and intensive, because you also mentioned the effect to wages, mental health, and also the early careers. And I think you provide some interesting recommendation, like establishing a better welfare system, and also parental leave, flexibility, and also network with potential links. So I think I'm going to open for discussion and also questions. For the first one, I think anybody can raise their hands. Also, I've seen some in the chat box that direct message to me, but I will read that later if nobody raises their hand. Okay, so so first, nobody raises their hand. I will read the question from Mas Eko Wahyono. Thank you for the presentation, Mrs. Irma. It's very interesting.
Thank
So
you.
he wants to ask that under what conditions can a child then get out of the absence of job that has been inherited by his parents or their parents? And what factors and conditions can enable us to get out of this intergenerational poverty trap in Australia? I think you mentioned about the factors to mitigate, such as university education and also household work. So I think it is important also for the fathers to do household to contribute for employment. So I think those are so far the two questions. Maybe you can elaborate more on the factors to mitigate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Echo, for the question. Well, let me then start first by saying what are the factors that explain the higher unemployment and joblessness rates among children. Well, of course, one of those is lower levels of education or lower educational qualifications, poor literacy, numeracy, and digital skills that make it harder for these children with a disadvantaged background to find and to keep employment. Another reason that is connected to high jobless rates is that, well, jobless or families that are poor or live in poverty, they also tend to live in remote areas, which provide limited access to employment opportunities and make it difficult to connect for children to connect with employers. So again, social capital plays a very important role. And thirdly, I would also say that unemployment and joblessness rates are very much associated with the occupational categories, with kind of children finding employment in occupational categories that require physical or routine workplace tasks, knowledge, and abilities, which also has seen a decline in the employment share due to automation of routine work. And so altogether, if we look at those three risk factors or three main risk factors, then a solution to get children back to work and a solution to reducing the intergenerational poverty trap would be, yes, to help children to not only access education, but also to access higher education. And the higher education and the specialized skills and knowledge and abilities will help them to not only find employment, but also create those connections that are needed to find well, permanent, ongoing employment. And of course, trying to upskill and or kind of have education into have it or kind of, let me rephrase, participating in education that helps young people to develop skills that that will be used for the occupations of the future will, of course, also help them to better prepare for the future of work, and that can be, you know, we know, for instance, that highly specialized skills will play a larger role in the future, and so probably the polarization of the labor market will grow even further, meaning that there will be a high demand of jobs that are highly specialized, but there will be also a demand of jobs that are that require routine work. But it's especially the jobs in the lower segmentations that are also at risk of automation and offshoring as well. So yeah, I think young people not only have to ensure that they are higher educated, but also that they think very carefully about the study of fields and about occupation and about the skills that they want to obtain and acquire for their future. So there is more advice, I would say, so and more consulting that needs to be provided by the government and by organizations that help poor families and their children to advise them about, you know, the the possible areas where they could best obtain the skills of the future. And also, of course, living in urban areas would also increase the chances of employment. And so location is also very important where these households live. So, and of course, for this, more could be done and should be done by the Australian government to provide a more generous welfare benefits, so that poor families can afford to live in urban areas and in bigger cities where there is employment and there are many opportunities. So I hope I have been able to answer your question, Echo.
I think Mas Eko has some kind of technical problems, Ibu Irma.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Further, he will message me if he needs some more explanation.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I think Ibu Irma has highlighted some important and crucial points to address and to mitigate the joblessness and also children poverty, such as social capital and also infrastructure access to rural areas, and also human capital. I think those are quite important that I think Indonesian government also is still trying to address this through conditional cash transfer. Okay, I think two people raised their hands, so I would like to give the time to Ibu Eli first, and then Mbak Nuzul. Bu Eli, silakan Bu.
Okay, thank you, Ms. TV. Yeah, very interesting. Your presentation, Prof. Irma. That I'm very interested about your graphic that you showed to us about the joblessness of start from 2001 until 2019, if I don't make mistake.
Yes.
My question is that was it the impact of the COVID-19 that it becomes so many apparent joblessness? That is, and how about the 2020 and until now? Is still are they still joblessness? And then very interesting too about 50% that you showed to us. 50% the youth who their parent joblessness, they will start with joblessness too. How about it? It is very poor for the girls and the children. Maybe that is they are still 17 or 15, or maybe for several years later, after they finish the school, they can look for job. I think that maybe like that. So maybe not that is like judge. No, parent no jobless. The children.
Hello, Ibu Eli.
Yeah.
Okay. Ibu Eli, I think you muted your speaker, so we cannot hear you right now. Okay. Yeah.
Very interesting that about the parent jobless, and then the young will start with jobless too.
Yes.
It's very poor for them. But I think we can still wait for their fit to finish their study. Maybe several later, maybe they will become adults and can look for another job, not like his father maybe. And they have to propose that. Then, and also interesting for me that what about the mental health for the children, and then household work. That is very interesting. That is very interesting. I agree that the couple, the parents, the father and mother, the couple work together and then give understanding to the children, like they like they less no job, like that. Yes, I think that and then one again my question. That is your recommendation. That is asked to the government to give financial for the family joblessness. I will ask. Up to now, there is no financial for family joblessness. Then there's your recommendation. I'll become or start today. Thank you very much, Irma, for your answer. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Eli. There are many questions, and I hope I've listed them. I've understood them well. I will start first with a graphic about the joblessness in the beginning from 2001 to 2019 and how that relates to COVID-19. Well, it does not. So the numbers that you see there, it's before the COVID-19 period. So this is the share of the jobless individuals or of children who were exposed to parental joblessness between 2001 and 2019. And so that number, of course, has fluctuated in 2020. So we are expecting to have a slightly higher proportion of children exposed to parental joblessness during COVID. And then we expect that share again to bounce back to the levels where we had about 13% in 2021, which reflects the period that we are now. It's just that we don't have the data yet. Otherwise, I would have shown you the period before and after COVID. But that would be a prediction that I would have, is that, yeah, there will be a slight increase in the proportion of household joblessness in 2020. And then that is going to decrease again in 2021 to around 13%. So I think that the numbers will, in the end, on average, be fairly stable. And then about the intergenerational link between parents who are jobless and then their children who become also jobless. You argued that probably children that the results that we showed are a function of these children being too young, and probably later when they finish education, maybe they find employment, but this is a period that we have not captured in the figures. And I would say that is not true, because these are children who finished and completed their education. So we only have included children who completed education, and then we saw their labor force status after they completed. So there is no possibility that children that we have missed children that later on. So what we have here is 5 years after, and we think that also that gives a big enough picture to see the patterns of joblessness dynamics after education. So and in terms of the household work, you're correct. We were very surprised to see the finding and to see that fathers' engagement in the house and also helping mothers and kind of working together and collaborating together as parents, that had positive influence on children and how children thought about work and about how they engaged also. And so it helped them to have a more cohesive family life, so parents and children. So that was very interesting. And yes, based on that finding, we would encourage fathers to do more at home when they are jobless, that will have an positive effect for their children. So even though it's difficult and it's very, and especially men losing their jobs, and also men that are expected to provide for their families in our cultures, of course, is the male breadwinner culture, then even though it's very hard for those men to accept that, and to accept their reality, that still they have to think about their children and stay engaged and provide a positive example to their children, because it will be positive in the future. I hope that helps, or that addresses the questions. Thank you.
Okay, Bu Irma, thank you. And then the next opportunity I'll give to Mbak Nuzul.
Okay. Thank you, Mbak Dewi. I would like to ask about what are the job trends that job seekers in Australia are looking for right now? Does the presence of the sharing economy, financial technology, and startups and so on affect the trend of job seeker there? Because as we know, jobs that offer automation actually employ only a few people behind them, but we don't yet know to what extent countries are tracking the dynamics of their presence impact on job creation. And will parents can enter to this kind of jobs, this startup? That's my question, Bu Irma. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is a very good question. We have So when we look now at the unemployment rates in Australia, they are amongst the lowest we have had in decades. So it's 3.4%, and that rate is even lower in Victoria, where Melbourne is located. So Victoria has a much lower unemployment rate. So it's 3.1% at the moment. So meaning that there are many jobs out there, and so hopefully, as soon as we get the new numbers, when it comes to the numbers for 2022, we will be able to see whether the proportion of jobless households has decreased, and the type of jobs that parents but also children can have that ranges between either casual work, which is comparable to what you call a 0-hour contract type of jobs. And in Australia, this is very unique because casual employment is very high. The share of casual employment is very high, and it's especially very high among women. And it's actually very unique because it provides for a very flexible labor market in which companies can hire and fire workers easily, but also workers themselves can move between jobs. So it provides a flexible labor market. The problem with the Australian labor market, however, is that it does not rely on an unemployment benefit system, as most of OECD countries have. So Australia relies on allowance system, meaning that this is a flat rate minimum assistance that is given to, it's like the social assistance that you would have in Indonesia. So it is not connected to people's incomes or previous employment to produce these replacement rates, but so the shock of unemployment and joblessness is very, very big for households in which parents used to work, and then if they have no work, then the household incomes drop at a very low level because there is no system of benefit system. And so for Australia to become we need to have a system that is more generous when it comes to families, because many jobless households live below the poverty line. And that's something that's a lesson for you in Indonesia to think more carefully, because you are reforming your unemployment benefit system. And I'm aware that the replacement rates at the moment in Indonesia are about 30%. And that is related with your previous employment and income history, which, as I said, is a much more better system than an allowance system. If we look to Europe, which is a much more older welfare state, it has an older welfare state regime, then we see that they not only have an unemployment benefit system, but also a social assistance. So there is a multiple layer of protection when it comes to incomes. And I think you also mentioned self-employment and startups, that is included, or the gig work type, that is indeed the self-employment. And I did not show you the percentages, but yeah, those are, when I showed the graph with parents who were employed, that included also parents who were self-employed during the observation period, and also children. But I did not categorize that further. But yeah, they are also included there. It's just, yeah, the gig workers as well.
Okay, Mbak Nuzul, I think, did that answer?
Yeah, I got yes.
Okay, I think we have a limited time today, but there is still one person to ask a question. Ibu Irma, do you mind to answer the questions in the chat from Bapak Muhammad? Okay. Would you like to answer? Okay.
Shall I read out? Thank you, terima kasih, Pak Muhammad. Pak Muhammad says, thank you for the excellent presentation. If and when parental unemployment matters for children's educational attainment, I would like to know your thoughts on actually employed parents, but in a precarious employment, which kind of become the norms in a jobless growth in formal economy countries such as Indonesia? That's a very, very good question. If I'm correct, and if I read it correctly, then you would like to know also something about the intergenerational connection between parents who are employed in the informal employment arrangements in Indonesia and their children later on. I would say that...
Okay, I'm sorry. I think that was a technical problem. We can continue.
I would say that this is one of the biggest challenges of Indonesia, the high share of informal employment. And children who live in households where both parents are engaged in informal employment will, given the intergenerational correlation, will also follow to some extent in the footsteps of their parents. It means that the risk is that this behavior, labor market behavior, will be reproduced in children, because children see their parents engage in informal arrangements, informal employment, and so they learn from seeing and from hearing, and also from seeing other people repeating the same behavior, and that in turn leads to a similar behavior among children, which means that the share of employment, informal employment in Indonesia will likely remain high in the future if the government does not take actions to increase the awareness among parents that formal employment is very important for them. So I think step one for Indonesia would be increasing awareness among older generations about the benefits of formal employment, the benefits of having this benefit system, unemployment benefit system, contributing to sick leave and health insurance, and also trying to convince them to actually move to formal employment because of the many reasons and many benefits related to employment. Among the younger generations, I think it would be best if in curriculum there are subjects built in that also explain young people, the benefits of this welfare system, and also the unemployment benefits, and the strong social security framework. And so it will take time, because culture takes time to change, but in the end, yes, there needs to be more actions from the government and from BRIN, I think, as an organization, when you can set up social labs, I would say, and experiment whether, for instance, providing more information will indeed lead to better outcomes when it comes to employment, formal employment, or the share of formal employment. And yeah, we can talk about labs and experiments in another presentation probably, but I think, yeah, there are many things that should be done in Indonesia to increase the share of formal employment.
All right. Thank you, Ibu Irma, for your extensive and comprehensive presentations. So I think we ran out of time today, and I would like to give the time for Ibu Nurul for giving a few sentences for closing statements.
Thank you
Ibu
very
Nurul.
much,
All right.
Dewi. Yeah, once again, thank you very much, Prof. Irma. It is very enlightening, your presentation today. I learned a lot. I studied in Australia, and I'm very surprised with your findings. So I hope that this will build a future collaboration between our center and also your university. So looking forward to collaborating with you. Thank you very much, Prof. Irma.
Thank you very much, Bu Nurul, and thank you very much, Bu Tiwi and Bu Dian and everyone else who was present today. It was a pleasure sharing the insights of Australia with you, and I hope this can be a good learning experience for Indonesia and for the next experiments that you are going to make. And thank you so much for inviting me. I very much enjoyed being here with you today, and I hope next time I will come to Jakarta and you will come to Melbourne. And yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ibu Irma. I think that was an insightful presentation. I think we learned a lot. We found some gap and also some new evidence to inspire us in research in joblessness and poverty. Particularly, I think mental health is a new field in Indonesia when it relates to poverty and joblessness. So I think I would like to share the the Japanese kanji. As I studied in Japan, I think this kind of presentation we can learn that there is a crisis in joblessness. So in Japanese they called crisis in kiki. So ki means dangerous, and another kanji is ki. It means opportunity. So in this kind of joblessness, I think we can learn one thing, that joblessness does have a potential danger, like people could fall in poverty, but also there are opportunities from this presentation, such as to upskill, to increase human capital, and to network with employers. So thank you, Ibu Irma, for your presentation. So, and thank you for all participants who has joined this session and asked the question. Hopefully this inspire us to do further research and compare with the condition of Indonesia for the future betterment. Thank you, everyone. I would like to close this event. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih. Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Terima kasih, Bapak Ibu.
Terima kasih. Bye-bye.
Terima kasih. See you next time, Prof. Irma.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Terima kasih, Mbak Tiwi.
Sama-sama.